We're here on Daf Chav Daled Amid Beis, and we're up to Omar L'Charav, which is about 2/3 down from the top of the Amud, and you'll see on the right side a Tosas Dima Maskal Omar Rebbe, and if you go down about let's say 5-6 lines of Tosas, you see the word Mafkina. Now, Rav is going to try to explain this brisa. We have a brisa that Rav had interpreted that in the case of Nitan al Eishes Ish, and the brisa has a case where the Bezdin forced a divorce because of this rumor that she had an extramarital relationship, and afterwards she received a get from her first husband, married a second fellow, and the so-called Boel, the accused adulterer, now went ahead and married her. And that's called afseke. In other words, there was some sort of a hefsek in the rumor. People already forgot the original rumor because in the meantime she was married to someone else. But Rav says that the case was that there were witnesses that testified that she had this extramarital affair. Because in the absence of Eidim, we would not force the husband to divorce his wife. We're not going to bust up a marriage just based on rumors. So the Gemara says, if that be the case, then why does the Brisa formulate this very complex scenario in which after the get, she married someone else, and then she got a divorce from, let's say, marriage partner number 2. Then she married the original Boel, and we're not going to bust up the marriage. It doesn't make any sense, because if there were witnesses to testify that she had that relationship with him, then we certainly should be breaking up the marriage. To the same extent we break up her marriage with her husband, that's called Echad L'Baal. We also have to break up the marriage with our partner, the Boel, because of the principle of Echad L'Boel. So therefore, even from the fact that the Brisa formulates a case where there was a hafsakas kol, right, because there was a marriage in between, and that's going to quiet down the rumor, it would seem that we do rely on kol. And the whole reason we're being matir here is because of afseke kol. Now, according to Rav, the Mishnah is talking about a case where we're going to break up the marriage only in a case where there are edei tumah. Kol itself, a rumor, is not something that we rely on to break up a marriage. But yet, from the fact that the Brisa will allow this marriage to continue because in between there was a marriage, and that's called afseke kala, the implication is that if it was kol, if there was a rumor without afseke kala, then we would break up the marriage. Whereas Rab's opinion is that we only break up the marriage when there are Eidim. Rav says, no, don't prove from this brisa that we would break up the marriage of the Nitan with the Nitan based on kol, based on a rumor without substantiating that rumor with clear-cut evidence of 2 witnesses. And in truth, this brisa is talking about a case where there were no edei tumah, there were no witnesses who testified to the effect that she had this extramarital affair. And the first husband, the original husband, divorced her based on the fact that he had heard a rumor that she was floating, she was having this affair. But for who I did, the afagav lo asa acher the afseke lekala And in truth, the Brisa did not have to introduce this extra element, this extra variable into the equation that she got married in between, and that's going to quiet down the kol, because everything depends not on the kol, but rather on the edim. Ika edim afkinon, ileka edim lo afkinon. Only if we could substantiate her extramarital relationship with two witnesses, only then would we break up the marriage that she had now with the original Boel, because that we can't accept, we can't tolerate such a marriage because we have testimony. But Ileka Edim, in the absence of witnesses, then Lo Mafkinon, we would certainly not break up the marriage. But now you're going to ask me, so why did the Brisa only mention this case where there was a Hafsakas Kol? She got married in between, the divorce from her first husband and the marriage to her original Boel. And the Brisa should have told me a greater chiddush, that even if there was no Hafsakas Kol, we're not going to break up the marriage because there were no Eidim. So why is it that the Brisa indicates that the reason we're not breaking up the Kol is because of the Hafsakas Kol, when in fact, even if there was an outstanding Kol that was active, we would still not break up the marriage according to Rav, because we don't have clear-cut evidence. And in the absence of clear-cut evidence, we don't break up a marriage. As Rav Hachikam, this is what the Brisa wants to teach us. A different thing. The afagav, the asa, acher, v'afsagol, kol echad chilo yiknos. The Brisa is really focused not on the issue of breaking up the marriage and implying that if there was an outstanding kol, an active kol, we would break up the marriage. No. We won't bust up a marriage with the Eved based on in the case of the absence of Aden. But this Brisa is focused and is completely giving attention to the issue of lechatchila. Lechatchila meaning we don't want to allow a marriage lechatchila when there's kol. And the Brisa is going very far with this. And the Brisa is telling us that even in a case where there was an afsaka kola, which means that in the meantime, in between, she got married to someone else, and the kol was quieted down, nevertheless, we're still not going to allow him, meaning the nitan, to marry her lechatchila. Do you see that, Rabbi? Say all the focus now, according to Rav, in this Brisa, is on the din of lechatchila, to tell us how far we're going to go lechatchila to outlaw or inhibit the marriage from taking place. We're going to go as far as to extend that isur lechatchila even to a case of afsaka kola, which again, we have to understand why that should be so. But again, the halacha of imkanas lo yotzi, that would apply whether or not there was afsaka kola. And even if there was no afsaka kola, we would not bust up the marriage with the Eved once there are facts on the ground that he married her, even unless we have two Eidim, even if there's an active kol. So the thrust of this Brisa is to be mechadesh that the halacha of lechatchila lo yiknos applies even in the case of afsaka kol. But as far as the din of imkanas lo yotzi, that applies even if there was no afsakas kola, because there's no clear-cut edus and testimony and evidence to the effect that she had this relationship. It's only kol, and in the case of kol, we will not bust up the marriage. But as far as the lechatchila is concerned, we're not going to make any distinctions whether it was afsaka kola or there was no afsaka kola. I don't know if this is a Durabanan, meaning the Rabbanan are afraid that if, in the case of Afsika Kola, will allow and encourage the marriage to take place, Chatfila, then in another situation where it was low Afsika Kola, they might go as far as to mistakenly encourage the marriage. Or maybe it means that we're not relying on Afsika Kola. Afsika Kola is a maybe. It's an iffy situation. There's still maybe people out there who remember the original rumor. They haven't forgotten it. It didn't go down into oblivion. And we have to worry about Lazarus Fasayim. You remember that the Gemara, actually the Mishnah, had quoted a pasuk in Mishlei, Haser Mimcha Ikshus Peh Ulezus Fasayim. And therefore we don't want the Nitan, and again in the case of the Mishnah had the issue of a man who was suspect by rumor of having a relationship with a non-Jewish woman. Now, after Hageris, he wants to marry her. Even in that case, we're not going to encourage and allow that marriage to take place because of Lazus Svasayim. How much more so in the case of a Boel, according to the rumor, he had a relationship with her. And now he's going to he wants to marry her? Imagine the repercussions of this. A man has an extramarital relationship with a woman, and then he marries her after. It's almost like a chote niska. We're almost rewarding him for the most terrible action that he did. And again, even though there are no clear-cut witnesses, and all we have is a rumor, and even that, the rumor is not so active anymore; it's dormant. But nevertheless, that's the way Rav is learning this price. That we will not allow this marriage to take place. Okay, Masechet. Now we have another kasha against Rav. When do we say that in the Brisa it says that the nitan? So let's try to focus on the case that we're dealing with in this Brisa. Because again, we always have to focus on the issue whether Eidim to testify on this znus of Eishes Isha, where there are no witnesses and it was only a kol. Now, according to Rav says that we would never bust up a marriage based on kol without clear-cut evidence of two witnesses. The Brisa, on the other hand, seems to assume that we would be willing to break up the marriage if there are no children involved. So, when will we bust up the marriage, even b'di'evet, with the nitan, and force him to deliver a get to his wife? Interesting. The question of how the Rabbanon will deal with a marriage that they're not happy with, and will they go as far as to require a get when there's a rumor that there was some sort of affair going on? That issue will be impacted and determined by the children, meaning we don't want to create a situation where the children will be stigmatized in the eyes of the people, the general populace, as mamzerim. That's called hotzas las, lamed ayin zayin, las. So now what happens? She had husband number one. The rumor had it that she had an extramarital affair. From that first husband, she had a child. And if you substantiate that rumor, then the child is at least suspect to be a mamzer. So that now, if the husband divorces her because of the rumor, she now, after her divorce, gets married to the nitan. Now we go ahead and bust up the marriage to the nitan. What does that mean? Why are we breaking up that marriage? Aren't we sending a clear message that this nitan was the boet, that she did in fact have that extramarital relation? We really don't know that that's the case. We're basing ourselves on a rumor. So now you're going to go ahead based on a rumor and break up the marriage, and therefore, ipso facto, substantiate the rumor. By substantiating the rumor, there's going to be otsas, las, and mamzeris on the child from the first marriage, because you're telling me that she really had that extramarital affair, and therefore lotates it. But you see clearly that this brisa, if not for the issue of hotzas las, meaning if she didn't have a child from the first marriage, the brisa would be willing to go as far as busting up the marriage to the nitan, even based on a rumor alone. The brisa continues, "Ve'im bo edei tuma," if on the other hand we have clear-cut evidence of two witnesses that she had this relation with the nitan, then teitze, we're going to bust up the marriage relation with the nitan, afilu yesh la kama banim, even if it means that there'll be otzas, las, and mamzeres on a number of children that she had from the first marriage. Why? Because although las is a very significant factor, how much does it weigh? It weighs in when we don't have evidence to break up the marriage. If we have evidence, then there's an Isur Doraisa called Echel Bal Echel Boel, the Parsha of Tumah. And with all due respect to las, we're not going to use las and therefore be matir and Isur Doraisa. That far we can't go. And why is there an Isur Doraisa? Again, just to review, because now there are two witnesses that testified that she had this relationship with the nitan. So it's not just a matter of rumor. We have clear-cut evidence. He cannot live with her because the Isur Doraisa of Tumah v'echel ba'al echel boel. In any event, we see clearly that if there wouldn't have been Eidim, then we would break up the marriage, if not for the fact that she has children, or at least one child from the first marriage. If there were no children for the first marriage, we would have bust up the marriage to the nitan, even in the absence of Eidim. And this is a contradiction to Rav, because Rav is of the opinion that only if there are Eidei Tumah, then we'll break up the marriage with the nitan, but not based on rumor alone. And here the Brisa would say that as long as we're not upsetting the status of the children from our first marriage, if we're not doing that, because she has no children from the first marriage, so there's no laws, then we will break up the marriage with the nitan. Based on what? Based on a kol, without Eidim. Says the Gemara, now to defend Rav Mukile lemas nisan b'sheyesh la banim. She has children from her first husband. And if she has children from her first husband, then we cannot bust up the marriage because of the laws that people are going to say that the children from the first marriage are mamzerim. So how are we going to bust up this marriage? And the answer is Yeshla Eidim. It could only be because there were two witnesses So mukile lemasnisa means that this brisa is addressing a case of yesh la banim. I don't know how you're going to fit this into the language of the brisa, because the brisa says avol, and at the beginning it says b'medra murim kishe'ein la banim. And I'm tempted to think here, I don't know, you'll take a look in your notes there, that maybe Rav is postulating a machlokas here between our Mishnah and this brisa. Because you'll notice that in our Mishnah here on the top of Dalet Amud Beis, there's no mention of Yesh La Banim or Ein La Banim. All that comes from a brisa. And therefore, since our Mishnah says Rav is talking about a case of Yesh La Banim, so she has children from the first marriage, therefore I have no choice but to assume that Yesh La Edim. So again, let's go over the mathematics here. If Yesh La Banim from the first marriage, then there's no way possible that we could break up the second marriage, because it's going to be motzi las on the children from the first marriage unless there are clear-cut Aiden. And therefore, Rav is going to have to interpret our Mishnah in order to reconcile our Mishnah with the brisa as talking about a case of Yesh La Edim. Right? There are Edim. Why? Because Rav is assuming they're a banim. And the brisa would also agree in the case of banim that we're not going to bust up the marriage to the nitan unless there are Edim. But in the absence of Edim, and it's only a rumor, we can't risk the reputation and the stigma and the status of the banim from the first marriage by busting up the marriage with the nitan. Now, if I understand correctly, at this particular juncture, Rav is sort of changing his opinion, and he's conceding that if there was no issue of banim and laws of mamzerus from the first marriage, then we would bust up the marriage, even in the absence of Eidei Tumah, and therefore our Mishnah must be talking about a case of Ein La Banim. I'm sorry, our Mishnah must be talking about a case of Yesh La Banim, and that's why we're not going to bust up the marriage. But in the absence of banim, then we have nothing to lose if we break up the marriage, even though there are no Edim. So let's see how the Gemara analyzes this. So now we're saying that Rav admits that if there are no Edim from the first marriage, then Teitze will break up the marriage even in the absence of Eidei Tumah. Mai duchte de Rav. What pushes Rav? What pressures Rav? To interpret the Mishnah as a case of Yesh La Banim, and that's why we don't break up the marriage. And now he's going to have to say that if there's Yesh La Banim, under what circumstances in the Sefer of the Mishnah? Does it say Afal Pisha Kanas Yotzi? We're going to bust up the marriage. That's Yesh La Edim. And once there are Edim, then Laza Hin and Laza Her, it's irrelevant. We have to break up the marriage because they're not allowed to live together. There are Edim. Edim Tumah. V'taima the Ika Edim Mafkinan v'Leka Edim Lo Mafkinan again, only because there are children from the first marriage and we don't want to be motzi laws. So the Gemara wants to know why does Rav feel so, his back is against the wall and he has no choice but to admit that in a case where there are no children from the first marriage, we will bust up the marriage even in the absence of Eidim. I have a better option. Lukma, why not interpret the Mishnah? B'she'ela banim, she has no children from the first marriage. Afal gav deleka edim, and even if all there is a call, there's a rumor, the Mishnah would still say teitzim imenu, based on a rumor. And I think what the Gemara is asking here is that Rav had in front of him two choices, two alternatives. He could have said that our mission is a case of Yesh Labanim, and only in Yesh Labanim will we allow the marriage to go on in the absence of Eidim. Or he could have alternatively said that, the Mishnah is talking about a case of Ein Labanim, and rumor alone is enough to break up a marriage. Even though there's no fallout, there's no negative impact on the banim because there are no banim. Now, I'm not sure why the Gemara feels compelled to find, so to speak, a source for Rav. Why couldn't Rav just simply be operating with his own logic? He doesn't believe for one moment that a rumor, a call is sufficient to break up a marriage. That I don't know. The Gemara seems to be recognizing a logical possibility that rumor enough is alone to break up the marriage. And therefore, the Mishnah says the Gemara could be interpreted as a case of Ein Labanim. And we're going to break up the marriage based on kol alone without any consideration here of Laz Labanim. Meaning, once you, Rav, are forced to admit that in a case of Ein Labanim, we're going to break up the marriage, because you're saying the reason why our Mishnah does not break up the marriage is because there are no children. So, I'm sorry, it's because there are children, right? That's why we're not going to break up the marriage. So why not just say the Mishnah talk about a case where there are no banim, and we'll break up the marriage simply because of the rumor. You follow? Meaning, again, once Rav has admitted that our Mishnah will not break up the marriage because there are banim, then he might as well interpret the Mishnah as a case of Ein Labanim, and will break up the marriage based on the call. Because Rav already admitted that we're going to break up the marriage based on the call. He's learning that the Mishnah will not break up the marriage only because there are banim. But in the absence of banim, then we're going to break up the marriage with the nitan, even though it's only a call and there's no Eidim. So once you've, hashda das lahachi, you've come to that position, why not just simply say the Mishnah is talking about a case of Ein Labanim? Why does Rav say that the Mishnah, right? Mukile masnisa b'yesh labanim. Why mukile masnisa b'yesh labanim? Omar Rava masnisin kshase. He had a cash on the lashon of Mishnah, and that's what pressed him to interpret the Mishnah in that particular way. If we're going to say that the Mishnah is talking about a case of Ein Labanim and a Rishon, absent are two factors that would let's say push in the direction of allowing the marriage to go on. Number one, there are no children from the first marriage. Number two, we don't have Eidim to testify that she had this relationship. So again, in the case of Ein Lo Banim, if our Mishnah is talking about that case, then you have no consideration of laws, and you don't have Eidim. So why are you breaking up the marriage? My area, why did the Tana say the Tana Hotzi Uha, meaning that we're going to break up the marriage against the will of the husband? Lisnei Hotzia. Why couldn't the Mishnah use a different language, Hotzia, a different scenario? That he decided on his own will, with his own free decision to divorce. And even in such a case, the Mishnah would say that we're not going to allow the Nitan to marry her. So this, says Rava, was Rav's kash on the Mishnah. Why did the Mishnah use the term Hotzi Uha and not Hotzi Ah? Hotzi Uha means they, the Rabbanon, took her out of her marriage and they forced the Baal to give a divorce against his will. Why not just say Hotzi Ah? And again, even though the Baal, the original husband, on his own goodwill and his own initiative decided to divorce his wife, we would still say that if the Nitan marries her, again, the Chatchil is not allowed to, but if he does, we're not going to break up the marriage. And that would have been a very simple presentation of the dinim if the Mishnah would have said it that way, but the Mishnah doesn't say it that way. Ella, so now Rav is trying to figure out why does the Mishnah say Hotzi Uha, which means Bal Karcho, Kol Hotzi Uha, Bebezdin. No, it's the mashmos, the meaning of Hotzi Uha means Bal Karcho Baras Bezdin. Bezdin decides that whether he likes it or not, we're going to break up this marriage, force a divorce. U Bezdin, when they go ahead and do this, they break up the marriage. That's only Be'edin, who demafte. For Bezdin to get actively involved and break up, force a divorce, that's only if they have witnesses to that effect. But based on a simple rumor, they're not going to break up a marriage and force a divorce. So therefore, Rav now comes up with the following interpretation of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where there are Eidei Tumah. And therefore, we don't have to wait for the husband to make that decision that he's going to divorce his wife. We are going to force him against his will to divorce his wife. Okay. But now Rav is forced to explain that the Mishnah is talking about a case where there are Eidim. And the reason why we are breaking up the marriage is because of the Eidim. Now Rav has no choice but to assume that we're talking about a case where she has children from the first marriage. And the reason why we're not going to break up the marriage is because of the laws of the children. So again, you follow what's going on here. Rav is sort of boxed in over here. he's going to have to interpret our Mishnah as a case where there are Eidim, because otherwise, what justifies the language Hotzi Uha, that Beis Din got actively involved in forcing the get? It must be because there are Eidim. And that's why the Mishnah employs the term Hotzi Uha. Okay, now we're talking about a case where there were Eidim. Now, if there are Eidim, then the Mishnah is clearly implying that a kol would not be enough for Beis Din to break up a marriage. Is that clear? I mean, I think that's crystal clear. That if our Mishnah is talking about Eidim, and therefore Tziuha, the implication clearly is that in the absence of Eidim, if you only had a kol, Beis Din would not force a get. Oh, so why wouldn't Beis Din force a get? So Rav answers because the Mishnah is talking about a case of Yesh Labanim. And what was the Gemara's kasha before? Rava Lukma v'Ein Labanim, because now we're saying that we'll break up the marriage to the Nitan, even in the absence of Eidim, and that l'chor should apply even in a case of Ein Labanim. So why did Rav interpret our Mishnah as a case of Ein Labanim? What forced Rav's hand to say that our Mishnah is talking about a case of Yesh Labanim? It's because, according to Rav, we have to interpret the Mishnah that there are Eidim. And that's why Beis Din will break up the marriage. If there were only a kol, Beis Din would not break up the marriage. But wait a second, we just finished saying that Rav concedes that Beis Din would break up the marriage even in a case where there were no Eidim. So why is the Mishnah talking about a case where there are Eidim? And the answer is because the reason why we won't bust up the marriage to the Nitan is because Yesh Labanim in Arisha. There's almost like a chadgadya here. A causes B. Why did the Mishnah, this was Rav's question on the Mishnah, use the word Hotziua? And the answer is because there are no Eidim. I'm sorry, because if there wouldn't, in the absence of Eidim, the Beis Din would not break up the marriage. Beis Din gets involved actively in breaking up the marriage because there are Eidim. But wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Because let's ask the next question. Now you've answered one question, but you've created another question, and that is that since we've already proven and Rav accepted this from the Brisa that Beis Din will break up the marriage, even based on what? On a kol. So why did the Mishnah say Hotziua? Says Rav because there are Eidim. So the answer is that whether or not Beis Din will break up the marriage in the absence of Eidim based on a kol, that's going to hinge on whether or not there are children from the first marriage. And if our Mishnah is talking about a case where there are Eidim, implying that without Eidim based on kol, we would not break up the marriage, it must be talking about a case where she has children from the first marriage. And that introduces the other variable, namely Hotzas Las. So it's so fascinating here because the original kash on Rav was, why not interpret our Mishnah b'Ein Labanim? What forces Rav to say the Mishnah is talking about Yesh Labanim? And the Gemara answers one question by asking another question. Why did the Mishnah say Hotziua? And the answer must be because in the absence of Eidim, there's no Hotziyah. Bezin will not get involved to break up a marriage. But now you have a kasha because we've already proved from the Brisa, and we assume the Mishnah would agree with that Brisa that will break up a marriage even with a kol without Eidim. Says Rav, then we're going to have to interpret the Mishnah as the case of Yesh Labanan. What was your question? Why not interpret the Mishnah of Ein Labanan? Oh, we don't have that luxury. There's no possibility of interpreting the Mishnah as Ein Labanan. Lukma be Ein Labanan. So it comes out that these are the rules. I think we could reduce the Mishnah, the way Rav interprets it, to three principles. Principle number one is Beis Din will actively break up the marriage if there are Eidim. Principle number two, even in the absence of Eidim, where we have only a kol, Beis Din might break up the marriage. Principle number three is that what will determine whether or not Beis Din will break up the marriage based on kol is whether she has children from the first marriage. In event that she has children from the first marriage, Beis Din is going to say, let well enough be. We are not going to break up the marriage. Why? Because there are no Eidim, and there are children whose reputation and whose future is at stake, is in jeopardy. Our Mishnah, therefore, must be talking about a case of Yesh Labanan, because fundamentally, if you would neutralize the issue of Hotzas Laz, in the case of Ein Labanan, then Beis Din would force a get, even, right, for the Nitan, even in the absence of Eidim based on Kol. And that's the only way we can reconcile our Mishnah with the Bryce. Now we get up to Ibois thing. This is a very exhausting sugya. Now, in my Gemara, he has an introduction to the Ibois Im, which I'd like to share with you, because I hope it'll give us a softer landing. Second. Now the Gemara is going to tell us that Rav should be understood. Rav's interpretation of our Mishnah should be understood independent of the Brisa. Forget about the Brisa. You've proven from the Brisa that Beis Din will break up a marriage based on kol, even in the absence of Eidim. Forget it. Rav is not, right now, is not dealing with that Brisa. He's dealing with our Mishnah. The principle that underlies our Mishnah is that kol is not enough to break up a marriage. Beis Din will not get involved in forcing a get just based on kol, even in a case where there are no banim from the first marriage. And that's clearly against the Bryce. But for Hani Masnisa, and you've proven from the Brisa that it's enough to have a kol without Eidim to bust up a marriage, Rebbe, don't confuse our Mishnah with that Brisa, because that Brisa reflects the unique sheet of Rebbe, who argues against our Mishnah. In other words, Rebbe is of the opinion that will break up a marriage even based on kol. Now he adds another point over here, which is going to become very important for us. Kol, a rumor, is one category. There's another category of something that is evidence, but not real evidence. It's not reliable. It's not conclusive evidence, because the only conclusive evidence that the Torah recognizes is the testimony of two witnesses. But just like there's halach of kol, there's another, kind of when there's smoke, there's fire, and we'll call it circumstantial evidence. And that is edus al davar mechur. Mechur means that he and she are obviously having some sort of intimacy. They didn't see what's called kimchol b'shvalfaris. They didn't actually see, the penetration, but they saw davar mechur, and they're testifying about that. And Rebbe holds that this lowercase evidence of either A or B, of either a kol, a rumor that she had this relationship, or B, testimony that she had a davar mechur, we will break up the marriage. If the nitan went ahead and married her, and is kol, we will break up the marriage. Why is Rebbe holding like that? Kevan shanesuim imanitan mechazkin mochichim shakol sheyotz aleim wems. You hear this paradox? He's saying A plus B equals C. C means full-fledged witnesses and absolute evidence. A is a kol, there's a rumor that he had this relationship. B is that he went in and married. The marriage itself is a proof that he had this relationship with her. And that's called a hochacha, that the kol is emes. So you have not just the kol, but you have something to substantiate the kol, and that is the fact that he went in and he married. Once we substantiate the kol, then it's similar to Einan. Now, Rebbe is based on the fact that not only is the testimony of two Einim enough to break up a marriage, but testimony on a davar mechur is enough to break up a marriage, and kol plus marriage is like a davar mechur. We have this flow chart. We got two Eidim, then we have Eidim that testify in a davar mechur, and now we are classifying kol on the davar mechur in the case where he went ahead and he married. Yisanya, we learned in the Brisa, and this Brisa is going to quote Rebbe, Rochel Yotze, V'isha chogeres b'sina. Omer Rebbe hol mechubra davar takes. Okay, so what happened here? This is the Resha of a Brisa that quotes Rebbe, and we're talking about a rochel. Now, it seems, when I was a kid, they used to say the door, what they used to say, the mailman. You remember that? I don't know if that comes from television or where it came from, but the mailman, right? In the time of the Gemara, the mailman, so to speak, was the rochel. You remember the advertisement, Avon calling, remember, ding, 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 right? So these are the mocher kesavim, the kishute nashim. These were the experts in cosmetics, and they used to go from door to door. The husband was out there in the working place, and they would show the women, great cosmetics and maybe jewelry and so forth and so on. They were there to make a buck, but he walks out of the house, and two Eidim watch him walk out of the house, and they see that she is putting on her clothes. Chogeres b'sinar. Now, sinar, I don't know how your English translation translates sinar. It could be translated as an apron, but it's kind of like bloomers, like underwear kind of thing. Oh, that's what he says? He calls it halavush hadomel l'michnasayim shenogos lachgar also litznius. Tznius means, to cover their privates. So she is fixing her private clothing, her undergarments, and he's running out in the building, saying, so they saw a bunch of pieces in the puzzle here that look very, smoky, if you know what I mean. Amar Rebbe Hol Mechubar Adovar. In other words, the circumstantial evidence seems to indicate that she had znus with the Rochel, meaning that she had taken off her bottom clothes in order to have this relationship, and now she's putting it back. Is Teitzeh. Wow. Rebbe is saying that this testimony is so reliable that we're going to break up the marriage. And it's like two witnesses who testified that she had this Bia relationship. Now we have another case. Again, the Rochel is running out, and the husband comes in, and he finds Rok Lamala min Akila. Now the Kila is a kind of just give me a second, don't tell me. At the tip of my tongue. They used to have beds that had canopies on it. It was built like a teepee. And on top of it, they put a canopy. The canopy is called a gag. The gag of a kila, which is, again, that covers the bed, so I'll read to you what he says here. Omar Rebbe, Hoel umechur adover teitzeh. Kevan shenira mitocha inyan shezinsa imo. Again, circumstantial evidence. V'shachva upanel lamala. V'rakaka klapi gag hakila. Located heich higia harok legag hakila. Not sure exactly what this rok here is. In Hechigia Harok Legag Hakilu. I can only say this, that they didn't see her actually lying in bed on her back, but they were able to determine that she was definitely lying on this bed with her face towards the top. Because otherwise, how did the rock jump onto the gag of the kilo? This can only be possible if she was laying on her back. What does he say in the English? You want to read it to me? I mean, it's a little bit gory, but
fresh saliva on the underside of the bed canopy had to have come from the head facing upward. Evidently, the peddler and the woman happened during relations that upward.
Yeah, I don't understand why it couldn't have been that somebody was walking by the bed and spat on the top of the bed. I don't know.
That is inside.
And
it's something else. Yeah.
No, but I'm just saying, it seems a little bit odd to me. The first case sounds like really condemning evidence, but the second case, okay, you found roke on the gut, so she had to be lying on her back. I don't know. I'm not 100% comfortable with it. But in any event, now we get to another case. Okay, so the husband finds min olim hafuchim. He finds shoes that are turned upside down, tachas hamita, underneath the bed. Omar Rebbe Hol Mechubar Adover. Again, circumstantial evidence that she had nus with somebody else. And apparently that person who had the relationship with her turned his shoes upside down, hoping that no one would recognize his shoes. Eitzeh, once again. All right, so just to summarize, we have three different scenarios in which Rebbe says that there's circumstantial evidence, it's a davar mechur, and therefore we're going to break up the marriage. So the Gemara now raises the following objection. Na'olim man olim hafuchim lechsei demanin. Why doesn't Rebbe require that we investigate, let's do a Sherlock Holmes detective work and determine who owns these shoes? That the Rochel that he saw running out of the house, or they saw, was the owner of these shoes. And that would certainly prove that, he was there under the bed. If, on the other hand, we determine that these are not his shoes, then why should we suspect that he had znus with her? We're over here. He says here in Enam Shalo, that I understood, but then he adds a few words that throw me off. He says, Kevin she'itochen sherak hifkid osam biyod. I don't know if it's not his shoes. I guess there were no shoes there before he came in. So even if it's not his shoes, so what are these shoes doing there? And the possibility is that, he lent her a pair of shoes, or she was watching a pair of shoes for him, but they weren't his shoes. So the answer is, Ella, why are we not requiring an investigation as to who owns the shoes? And the answer is b'makom min olim hafuchim tachas hamita. Notice they didn't find the shoes themselves upside down, but rather in the karka, which is next to the mita, right next to on the ground next to the bed, they found like footprints, as if there were min olim hafuchim. So it means that now we have clear indication that somebody came to have his nus with her. He turned over his min alim so that they shouldn't recognize him or identify him through his min olim. Okay, now we swing back to our brisa. We had a brisa back on Daf Chav Dalet that we're going to break up the marriage with the Boel even in the absence of Eden. That brisa reflects the sheet of Rebbe, who holds that based on a davar mechur, circumstantial evidence, even in the absence of Eden, if there's a rumor that this is the person who had a relationship with her, then we will break up the marriage with her husband. And as far as the Boel is concerned, Rebbe holds we're going to break up the marriage with a kol, and we don't even need Eidei Kiyur. The very fact that he went ahead and he married her, that clinches our suspicion and our rumor that he had znus with her. So in the case of the husband, we don't have any of that extra proof to go that extra 10 yards that in fact she had this extramarital relationship. So we can only break up the marriage if we add to the equation a davar mechur with, right? A davar mechur plus the kol. So that's A plus B, and that's going to give license to the Bezdin to break up the marriage with her original husband. As far as the Boel is concerned, we don't even need a Q. We don't need that circumstantial evidence. Why? Because the very fact that there was a rumor, and the fact that he married her, that itself, like a Q, which is enough to force a divorce with her original husband, so too the marriage on the part of the Nitan is enough to break up the marriage. But on the other hand, Rav is of the opinion that in our Mishnah, we're not going to assume that we break up a marriage with the Nitan based on a rumor. That which you found in a brisa that will break up a marriage based on a rumor, on a kol, that is reflective of the shita of Rebbe. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop for today. And the Masechet tomorrow, hopefully we'll be able to finish up to the Mishnah, maybe even start the Mishnah here on Daf Chaf Hey, Amid Al.